Welcome back. You're listening to A Path to Wellness on rhinoonair.com, WSPF-DB.com. And today we're going to talk about food choices and making healthier food choices. I think the show's been dubbed You Are What You Eat. And there's nothing more true than that, except that you may not be a vegetable exactly, but what you eat definitely affects your health. And that comes way back. Knowledge of that and understanding of that has been existing since Hippocrates. And you may be familiar with Hippocrates because you may have heard of or be familiar with the Hippocratic Oath, which is basically physician first, do no harm. So obviously we've evolved from that time and that principle into more of a system where we have a balancing of risks and rewards. And if the risk is greater than the reward, then we don't do it. And if the risk is less than the reward, then at least conventionally, that's the approach to treating, or at least part of it. So in terms of the concept of food being part of you, it really comes from food, let food be your medicine and medicine be your food, which was also a quote from Hippocrates. And when we're talking about what we eat, a lot of us have different ideas about what is healthy and what's not. Back in the 70s, in that realm of time, we had the earlier version of the food pyramid. And we were told that, fat is bad and grains are good. And lots of grains and very little fat was the way to go. Okay, so we've come to understand through a lot of research and sort of, conventional wisdom as well, that that's not exactly right. And even the ideas of fat consumption being directly influencing cholesterol levels is something that we've recently been seeing debunked. And that may shock some people because you're still probably seeing a physician who goes on that model that fat is the enemy. And that, if you eat high cholesterol food, you're going to have high cholesterol. That is not necessarily the case. There's to some extent, there's some influence from that. But the core problem is sugar. Too much sugar in the diet. Too many carbs, too many carbohydrates, and especially from starchy carbs. So specifically, we're talking about things like wheat, grains, cereals, bread, pasta, rice, corn, these kinds of things. The high carbohydrate grains are full of sugar. It's not just eating refined sugar we're talking about, or having a lot of sugar in your food. We're also looking at the fact that the sugars inherently present in the grains are contributing to that carbohydrate load or glycemic index. So the old focus on grains as, having whole grain meals, whole grain bread, whole grain, is not necessarily the best way to look at it, the best focus for health. And there have been some books come out recently about grains, consumption of grains, and how they're problematic for many, many people. There's one called Grain Brain that came out a few years ago about how the effects of the sugars from the grain and other aspects of the grains can be detrimental on one's thinking and the evolution of the brain with time evolving in terms of the end result. Basically, you're more likely to end up with something like Alzheimer's, maybe a different form, maybe dementia as opposed to Alzheimer's. You're more likely to end up with those kinds of scenarios when you're consuming a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of grains, a lot of starches. Now, when I talk about starches, I like to emphasize that there are good choices for starches.
I have to break this for 1 second. When you just said that, Doc, I thought, let's talk about starch, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Because starch is a huge, huge part of the detriment of people, for example, like myself. I can speak for Latinos and Italians, that we eat so much pasta and it's so embedded in our culture.
Yes.
And right now I'm starting to experience some sugar issues as well. And as I'm listening, I'm thinking that I'm eating, fairly healthy because I'll take the pasta with good tomato sauce and olive oil and garlic. And I think I'm eating good. And at the same time, I'm killing myself. So I don't want to undermine, and I had to stop there for a second. I want everybody to pay very good attention to this information because it really can change your life.
It can change your life. It can make you far more healthy, can make your thinking much more clear. It can help you avoid or diminish the effects of autoimmune disorders, where your immune system is attacking your own body in one form or another. And there are many forms of those. So one of the bugaboos that's coming up over time here is gluten, and that's related to the grains as well. And gluten is becoming more and more known as a potential source of trouble for people, especially with autoimmune disorders, because it can be a trigger of an autoimmune attack. And, many of my patients who have autoimmune disorders, like the first thing that we talk about is getting gluten out of the diet. Gluten is a major one. Soy is another one. Soy can be a real problem for many people. Now, it can be helpful for some, especially for menopausal women who need some estrogen in their diet, because it has phytoestrogens. But then again, even though it can be helpful, then we want to make decent choices beyond that. So, a lot of the basic choices that are considered healthy are on a top level potentially healthy, but you still have to look at the details. And what I'm getting at there is particularly genetic modification. So very commonly genetically modified foods are soy, wheat, and corn. A lot of GMO, a lot. Also, many others are genetically modified. Genetically modified peanuts. Peanut butter is not necessarily pure, even if it just says peanuts. It may be GMO peanuts. Unless they say not genetically modified or not sourced from genetically modified sources, or organic or non-GMO, which is, there's actually a project involved in assuring non-GMO foods. You just don't know. And in many cases, even if they say not sourced, we do not source genetically modified foods, there is still a pretty good potential of contamination with genetically modified sources. So you have to be very careful about these things It's helpful to be very focused on these details when it comes to making your choices. And why is this such a big issue? Well, there have been studies showing lab animals developing cancer with consumption of genetically modified foods. That's one reason that's an issue. But at the core, cancer is an inflammatory disease, an inflammatory disorder. And this is true for any form of inflammatory disorder. If you're eating genetically modified foods, it's very likely that you're going to create more inflammation in your body. And if you have an inflammatory disorder of any kind, and there are so many, most of the chronic disorders are inflammatory nowadays. Everything from rheumatoid arthritis to Hashimoto's to, on and on. Just, there's so many of them. And yeah, we can get into things like hypertension, we can get into cholesterol, hypercholesterolemia or high cholesterol, bone and joint disorders such as osteoarthritis as well. There's so many of them. And metabolic syndrome is one where we have several forms of disease or disorders that are combined in the individual. One person having diabetes and high cholesterol and hypertension and maybe coronary heart disease. All of these kinds of things can be combined in one individual and are growing in our population. And why would they be growing in our population? Because we have an inflammatory diet. Now, the inflammatory diet is not just because of GMO either. It really goes back to having an animal-based diet. And a lot of you who are real serious carnivores are not going to like hearing that. You're probably going to poo-poo it or something. But facts are facts. We come from a species that was a grazing species that went through the fields and found berries, found nuts, found plant foods. And the majority of our consumption was plant food. It was only a rare incident that we would have animal food. And so we didn't have as much disease historically. As we've evolved as a species and have increased our consumption of animal food, we have also seen a dramatic increase in inflammatory disease and chronic disorders because we're consuming inflammatory foods. Dense animal proteins, beef, even, I know that conventional wisdom is that poultry is healthier than beef, and so chicken, turkey is healthier than beef, and this kind of thing. but not necessarily. They're still inflammatory. They're pro-inflammatory. And so the ultimate diet in terms of inflammation and chronic disease is a plant-based diet. Study after study has been showing this over decades now. And as we consume more of a plant-based diet and less of an animal-based diet, we see levels of inflammation go down. And chronic disease has less of a prominence. For example, if someone's eating more of a plant-based diet, in fact, a completely plant-based diet, they're very likely to become more alkaline. Their bodies are going to become less inflamed. And that alkalinity helps to dissuade the development of inflammatory disease, such as cancer. So to help us avoid these really problematic disorders in later stages, it's very important to look at the healthiness of one's diet and any contributing components that might be pro-inflammatory. So what else is inflammatory? Well, I started off talking about sugars, and then I went to animal protein. Those are two major contributors to inflammation. Sugars, sweet starches, and animal protein. The denser the animal protein, it appears to be the denser the animal protein, the more inflammatory. And sugars, sweets, carbs, why? Because they make the body acidic. They're acid forming in your body. Your body doesn't clear the inflammatory substances that are produced as well when you're consuming a lot of these foods, quote unquote. So I think more natural foods that are not GMO, not genetically modified, and basically I would just about turn the food pyramid on its head, but then I wouldn't be sponsoring the grain industry, would I? You know, this is a large part of this whole thing is we have an environment in which the grain industry lobbyists promote measures in the legal system that help to promote that industry. And one of those happens to be the contribution of grains to the recommended diet of people in the US. So we have some conceptual issues, like if you think that a healthy diet is meat and potatoes, you're way off course. And I've seen a lot of people that basically live on meat and potatoes, you know. And when you look at what the fast food restaurants are based on, look at that, meat and potatoes, right? Fries and a burger, right? And to top it all off, a Coke, right? Great stuff. So you've got a very inflammatory combination there. The Coke, of course, would be full of sugar or artificial sugars, which are actually worse than sugar, not better, that lend to development of glucose regulation issues, problems, very problematic for glucose regulation. So they contribute to increased insulin resistance. They contribute to the development of diabetes. And that's not just the sugary ones, that's also the ones with artificial sweeteners. They're worse, not better. So no matter what the total carbs tell you in that case, your body's being fooled if you're consuming artificial sweeteners. And it really drives you toward diabetes and other forms of diabetes. Like when I say diabetes, I'm thinking of type 1 and type 2, but type 2 primarily. But type 3, you may not have heard of, but that's just another term for Alzheimer's because of the effects of glucose in the brain. So we have, or dementia anyway. So we have major contributors that are standard parts of the standard American diet. Sugar, fat, and I'm not saying all fat is bad, it's not. Much of the fat is good. But sugar, fat, beef is a big part, standard American diet. Dense animal protein, basically, and starches. So where do you get your antioxidants and all that? You know, where are the vitamins and minerals and nutrients that you need to thrive, to be healthy? How does your body repair when you're not giving it the core nutrients it needs? So where do you get those nutrients? Well, maybe it's from that piece of a leaf of lettuce that's on your burger and that slice of tomato, right? Oh, and the ketchup that's in the ketchup on the burger that is full of high fructose corn syrup that leads to a fatty liver. Maybe that's where it's coming from, right? Or maybe it's that greatest source of antioxidants in the American diet, according to Dr. Oz and many others. Coffee. Is that how you should get your antioxidants, from coffee? Increasing your caffeine, increasing your heart rate, increasing your blood pressure. Oh, and by the way, you can go ahead and have that if you have high blood pressure, right? According to some so-called experts. It's crazy. A plant-based diet gives you all sorts of phytonutrients, all sorts of micronutrients and macronutrients. You're getting fats, good fats from nuts. You're getting antioxidants of a tremendous range. You're getting the carbohydrates in a form that are much better than grain carbs. You know, if you look at wheat, processed wheat is chains of glucose. Those chains of glucose is the lowest, most broken down form of sugar. So when you're eating your bread, you're chomping on chains of glucose that you're breaking down that go right into your bloodstream. So you're raising your blood sugar. And if you do a lot of that at once, you're going to spike your blood sugar. You're going to raise it dramatically. And if you do this on a regular basis, you're going to be swinging that blood sugar up and down, up and down, up and down all the time, because you're going to be surging insulin, which will then drop your blood sugar, then give you cravings for more of those carbs. And that's part of that whole cycle that ends up with diabetes and many other disorders. So, you know, conceptual healthy diet is, say, one of the promo here. I'm getting off track of that one, but basically one of the promoters of their own food that says they're healthy is Subway, right? Subway, and you see these people that have lost weight on Subways. Okay, so what's the main component of that Subway? Bread. That's the big one. And then, okay, so you put some variety of vegetables and maybe some sliced meats, sandwich meats in there, probably full of nitrates, which are, potential cancer causers or carcinogens as well. They're inflammatory. The veggies, you have a few veggies, that's good. You got some antioxidants in there, at least you got something. And then you have this huge bread that's all these carbs that are contributing very much to your sugar levels. So it's in your hand is a very inflammatory meal. So, and again, the wheat is probably it's probably genetically modified. It's full of sugar in a glucose form, the lowest form. So this is not what I call a healthy diet. So, for example, when I was kind of in a transitional phase toward a much more plant-based diet, much more, earlier, I was using more of a model of minimizing carbohydrates, kind of along the lines of what is now what was the Atkins diet and is now the South Beach diet, and there's others that go along with that. But basically it was my own, meal concept, but it wasn't Atkins because I did consume carbs slightly. I was limiting my carbs. And that comes from the work of people like Dirk Pearson back in, I guess, the 70s or 80s. When I was reading back then and studying some of this stuff, there were studies showing that carbohydrate restriction added to longevity. Yes, you can live longer and a better quality of life by restricting your calories. That's really what it was, calorie restriction. But where did most of those calories come from? Carbohydrates. What kind of carbohydrates? Starches. What kind of starches? Grain starches. So basically, I would say if you just love your Subways, go into that half loaf of bread they give you and scoop out all that filler stuff, all that inside part, and just have the crust and just for something to wrap it all in or something like that. That's how I would approach it. Get rid of most of the starchy inner part and just have that crust and fill that up. At least it's, it does break down very quickly, but it will be averaged out with all of the better foods. It will be a much lower portion of that sandwich if you've got to have sandwiches. Now, of course, a better option is to go with salads. Okay, so what's wrong with the salads? Well, if we go deeper there, well, let's see, pesticides. Haven't even talked about pesticides yet. So we've got veggies that are, being supplied by these chains that are full of pesticides. So even if you're getting the antioxidant benefits of the vegetables and fruit, chances are you're consuming quite a bit of a range of pesticides, especially if one of your favorites is strawberries. Strawberries are saturated with hundreds of pesticides. Generally speaking, they're saturated. There's so many sprays applied to strawberries, it's unbelievable. So, you know, here in Florida, we have the Strawberry Festival, which has recently gone on in Plant City. And you can bet that the majority, if not all of those strawberries, were coated in hundreds of pesticides. And people are buying them up like by the slat, you know, by the box. And what's wrong with these pesticides? Well, you know, they're neurotoxins typically, combined with xenoestrogens, which can affect the hormones, affect your hormone levels, throw them off. If you're a woman and have hormonal problems, you really need to look at xenoestrogens. Where are they? Well, in the pesticides on your food, for one, and also in your makeup. You should be looking at that. That's why you may have heard of a lot of manufacturers limiting or removing parabens, for example, which are xenoestrogens. But there's other xenoestrogens too. You know, we have a power plant over in Apollo Beach here in Florida, in the Tampa Bay area, that's spewing out all sorts of toxic chemicals into the air. And where does that land? Well, right next door to Apollo Beach, you have Ruskin. And what is Ruskin famous for? Tomatoes. So what are those tomatoes getting saturated with? Mercury, lead, cadmium, heavy metals, other kinds of toxic substances going into the air that then land on the food and the people and the houses and are in the air that they're breathing. So what have they had a mad rush to do? Move all sorts of families into the area. Real estate has gone crazy over in that area in the last decade. Well, I guess maybe the concept is if you have more people breathing it in, then it filters it out of the air. So, you know, at a certain point, I kind of get exasperated by this whole thing because I see it every day, all the time, in everything I read, everything I see on television with these ads. You know, I don't watch a lot of TV, but when I do, and you know, all of this stuff, it's pathetic. We have to get more focused in understanding that this stuff is not good. You know, we're doing this to ourselves and we're allowing these industries to do it to us. We're allowing our politicians to pass laws that benefit the industries that pollute us, that give us these industrial byproducts that destroy our bodies, destroy our health, lead to diseased populations, lead to high medical bills, lead to a messed up medical system. We've got to start paying attention, folks. Got to start paying attention because it's happening. All of this stuff has been going on for a long, long time. There is more awareness. It's growing. But even in the majority of those who are aware, there's still not a deep enough level of understanding of the depth of this issue, of these issues, I should say, of what's in your food. I mean, you make what you think are healthy choices. People tell me all the time they're using olive oil to cook with. No, don't do that. You're creating trans fats. If you're heating that olive oil up above 110 or so, you're creating a chemical reaction because they're unsaturated fats. So if they're unsaturated, they're going to bond with whatever's in their environment. It's going to transfigure the molecules. They're going to end up as trans fats. You know, we should be cooking with saturated fats because the saturated fats will not bind with external environmental substances, and therefore they're healthier. They're going to stay in their form in your body. And we do have some need for saturated fat in our bodies. So, you know, but this all comes from, you know, this concept of not consuming any saturated fat, you know, and avoiding it like crazy, comes from, again, back in like the 70s and so on, when, you know, fat was the big problem. I used to, even back then, I was kind of laughing at it because, you know, you would have, and it's still true. I mean, you have all these fat-free foods. And what are they full of? Well, to make up for the lack of taste sensation from the fat, they fill them with sugar. And that actually is more damaging than the original fat. Another example, margarine, conceptually. Get rid of the saturated fat, have more margarine. So what do people do with the margarine? They cook with it, creating what? Trans fat. So even if it starts out as maybe healthier for some, from some points of view, the end result is worse than what you started with. And that's what we're doing over and over again. Let's see, when Donald Rumsfeld got through his famous artificial sweetener that has been shown many times to lead to brain tumor development and this kind of thing, NutraSweet. I believe he also had a hand in Splenda, which is very, you got to read these things. You got to read closely because here's an example, Splenda. Okay, so you know, many people are aware that sucrose is sugar, right? Refined sugar, okay, sucrose. And sucrose is composed of glucose and fructose in the molecule. But sucrose sounds a lot like another word you'll see on packages, sucralose. Guess what sucralose is? Splenda. So you've got to watch. If you're just reading quickly, you may totally miss this. And Splenda contributes to increasing insulin resistance, leading toward diabetes. So if you're cutting back on sugar by putting in Splenda, you're doing yourself a disservice. I sometimes pop into a Starbucks or something, okay? And yes, I do go to Starbucks, and I've talked about how I do that. And somebody will be ordering their coffee with 6 or 7 Splenda. And I'm like, oh no, I want to tell them, but I don't.
Is there any place that people can go on the website to actually maybe find, you know, some of these tables and things that'll help you understand, or, you know, kind of like what Weight Watchers does? You're out there during the day.
You mean glycemic index?
That's one.
Okay.
So, and resources where we can stay abreast of these kind of things.
Well, for example, when I was in Australia, I got exposed to was pleasantly surprised by the amount of work being done in natural medicine over in Australia. But the University of Sydney in Australia has a site, and I believe it's called glycemicindex.org. And you can go to that site and look at the glycemic index on all sorts of food choices. You know, it'll show you that For example, if you have spaghetti, you're getting the glycemic index of spaghetti will be somewhere around 53, and the glycemic index of spaghetti squash will be more like a 3. So I was going to kind of segue into that part of it all too. So when I talk about starches, generally I'm talking about grain starches, right? But we also have other choices of starches, very good choices. Squash. There are, what, hundreds of varieties of squash. Squash in many forms is a wonderful starch, a great starch, and much, much, much lower in glycemic index than the grains, than the pastas, all of this. So this is a great way to go. Start looking at squashes and figure out what kinds of squash you like. Some of my favorites are butternut squash, spaghetti squash. Pumpkin kind of falls into that category as well. So, you know, there's a lot of flavor there. Zucchini. You know, yellow squash is good occasionally for me. I like it, but some of the others I find more flavorful. Acorn squash. Start experimenting with some of these. Bake them. Make yourself something that is a starch in your diet, but not a grain starch. The grain starches are problematic. The grains are problematic. And then we add to the basic problems of sugar and, the basic nutritional deficiencies that may be present, especially if they're processed grains, where they remove all those nutrients, which has been the history of breads that caused issues like pellagra, deficiencies of some of the basic B vitamins. And then they started adding in the nutrients and saying they were enriched flours. Enriched. They were deficient and devoid of nutrients. And then they added a little bit back, and then they called them enriched. That's really rich. Okay, so that's where that all started with breads and so on, and they started to catch on to that. But what else do we do to this stuff? Well, these grains, we're using bromates and bromides and chlorine and fluoride in our water to bake these things. So what are you getting? You're getting those substances that affect your metabolism, run down your thyroid, lead to development of various cancers and all this stuff in the baked goods. People gain more weight than they should be by eating the basic grains, partly because those contaminants that are part of the process of baking cause more metabolic issues. Another disorder, just sort of a side note, we've seen a lot of increase in is autism spectrum disorders, right? That range of disorders. And this is one of the things I've mentioned in the past. I've done a lot of research in this as far as the studies of the contribution of deficiencies to development of ASD. And all of these components that run your thyroid down, if you're a female who's pregnant, can be a really big deal because, one, you're going to gain more pregnancy weight, which may not be healthy. But aside from that, your thyroid function will be reduced, very likely. And if you're low thyroid while you're pregnant, then that baby is not getting the nutrients the baby needs to develop properly in the brain. And this is part of the etiology of the development of autism spectrum disorders. And this can also lead into things like dyslexia and learning disabilities and all this kind of stuff. And it relates also to low vitamin D levels. So these are important things to look for while a woman is pregnant and are often missed, unfortunately, which is part of why we see so much growth in those disorders. So basically, we're just kind of not paying attention enough. And for those who poo-poo all of these little details, frankly, I think there's an element of, not to be judgmental, but laziness, not paying attention enough to your own health and the things that contribute to your health. And I've been guilty of that myself, for myself. It's really hurt me at times. But I've learned from it and I've grown from it. I've tried to continue to focus on these things and develop more. And do a lot, obviously, of research and studying and this kind of thing. And if you will kind of open your eyes and look at what's out there and start listening and learning and growing in your efforts to filter out the all of the negative aspects of the food in the United States, which are huge, very broad, many, very, very prevalent in the food in the United States. You'll be moving toward a greater state of wellness and much healthier prospects for your life, for a quality of life that you may not even have imagined you could achieve. So there are just so many things to look out for in what's in our food. If you just go by something like the food pyramid, you're very likely to be led astray. You've got to look deeper. And hopefully I've touched on the majority of those kinds of issues, give you some idea of what I consider looking deeper at what's in your food and how it affects your health, and therefore healthier food choices. So thanks for listening. I guess we'll call that a wrap. And you've been listening to A Path to Wellness on rhinonair.com, WSPF-DB.com. And if you'd like to get a hold of our practice, that's A Path to Wellness. You can reach us at 727-329-9637, or you can take a look at our website at aptw.net, short for A Path to Wellness. So hope that was interesting for you, and we'll talk to you next time.